Hello everybody, and welcome to a new video on my channel. The title of this video is The British Civil Rights Movement. When we think of the Civil Rights Movement, we often think of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. We often think of the Montgomery bus boycott, segregated schools, toilets and water fountains. There is hardly any weight on the British version. Worse, there is only one video on YouTube that I could find about it. And it wasn't a video essay or a documentary, it was just a televised report by British Pathé, a newsreel organisation where all of its newsreels are now archived that captured events that happened around the world. Ironically, when you type the Black British Power movement on the search bar, you get more videos, you even get documentaries, even though the Black Power movement was more radical. This could be due that this period is slightly more memorable as it took place mainly in the 1970s and 1980s, whereas the civil rights movement was in the 1950s and 1960s. Who knows? Anyway, let's get on with this video. Now, you may or may not have heard of the Notting Hill Carnival, which takes place annually within the second last week of August over the course of 3 days, which is hosted in the Notting Hill area in West London. It is attended by around 2 million people each year and celebrates Caribbean identity, expression and pride. But did you know that the foundation of Notting Hill Carnival was set up by Claudia Jones? Now, who was Claudia Jones? Claudia Jones was an anti-racist campaigner and journalist who founded the UK's first ever black newspaper, the West Indian Gazette, which was later changed to the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News. Born in Trinidad and Tobago, she got involved in multiple organisations in the USA before being deported to the UK for quote-unquote un-American activities. She was not deported to Trinidad because the colonial governor at the time denied her entry to avoid her influencing her people. Instead, she influenced racialized people in the UK. She faced racial discrimination in late 1950s Britain. She believed that people without a voice were lambs to the slaughter, so she made it her mission for black people to be heard. As a result, she founded the West Indian Gazette, Britain's very first black newspaper. Because racial issues also widened to Africans and Asians, the newspaper changed to West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News. Founded in Brixton, South London in 1958, Jones worked on the original development of the newspaper with Amy Ashwood Garvey, Marcus Garvey's estranged wife. The newspaper quickly gained a circulation of 15,000, and Jones worked as an advocate for the Caribbean community, which had a population of around 100,000. In the summer of 1958, the White Defence League, led by Oswald Mosley and other racist gangs, began attacking West Indian communities, especially in Notting Hill, West London, and the city of Nottingham in East Midlands, which eventually led to race riots in the respective areas. But before this, racist white British youth gangs were created, an example being the Teddy Boys, and they were incredibly hostile to black newcomers in the Notting Hill area. This was further influenced by meetings held by the Union of British Freedom in West London, led by Oswald Mosley, who attempted a public comeback from his downfall back in the 1930s as former leader of the British Union of Fascists. Attendees in meetings would rally, "Keep Britain White." Concerns were raised by Caribbean community leaders about how it could lead to conflict, but no action by the government was taken. On August 20th, 1958, property owned by Caribbean immigrants were vandalized and they were subject to physical harassment. 4 days later, 9 members of the Teddy Boys attacked 5 black men in Notting Hill and nearby area Shepherd's Bush. The race riots in Notting Hill began on August 29, 1958, when 350 to 400 white youths chased the Caribbean population in that area. Petrol bombs and milk bottles were thrown as missiles. Some white youths even armed themselves with armed bars and butcher knives, which prompted black youths to counterattack in self-defense. Seymour, a Jamaican man who was living in Birmingham, came to London to visit relatives and told Daily News London, a newspaper at the time, that he was beaten by a crowd of men and women. 3 white youths sprung out of a van and attacked him. He ran to the local greengrocers and said, "They are going to kill me." There were over 140 arrests, and unsurprisingly, most of the people arrested were black people. The riots lasted until September 5th. The white working class community had launched an attack against the black community. On January 30th, 1959, Jones hosted an indoor Caribbean carnival at St Pancras Town Hall in King's Cross, North London. The event was also broadcasted by the BBC. Claudia Jones believes that a people's art is the genesis of their freedom, and launched the festival as a way to uplift the community, celebrating its culture and heritage. Multiple Caribbean indoor events were held around early 1960s London. Edric and Pearl Connor, a Trinidadian couple who were booking agents with many partners, including the West Indian Gazette, began promoting these events. Tragedy struck a few months later on May 17, 1959, when an Antiguan-born man, an aspiring lawyer named Kelso Catrain, was murdered in a racially motivated attack in Notting Hill. Rab Butler, the then Home Secretary, appealed for witnesses and launched a public inquiry into race relations, but concerns of complacent investigation and a police cover-up was prevalent, and the case remains unsolved. Over 1,200 people attended his funeral. To ease the racial tension, local activist Ron Laszlo, who was of Native American and Russian descent, organized the street fair. Speaking about the community, she said, "We felt that although West Indians, Africans, Irish, and many other nationalities all live in a very congested area, there is very little communication between us. This was another beginning of the chain of events that would lead to the Carnival." In 1966, the first outdoor Caribbean festival took place in Notting Hill, marking the birth of the Notting Hill Carnival. Again, Ron Laszlo organised an event for the local children and set out to include West Indian residents in it. She also invited the Steel Pan Band to play. They were already popular amongst the Caribbean community, having regularly played in indoor events. Many local Caribbean residents attended as the band travelled through the nearby street Portobello Road, as locals followed and danced in the street. The founders of the carnival are Claudia Jones, Ron Laszlo, and Duke Finn, a Jamaican sound operator who operated the first sound system in the UK. Notting Hill Carnival is unique and remains one of the biggest events worldwide. Racial segregation was also very common in the UK and was entirely legal up until 1965. It operated on a colour bar, which spread it to shops, workplaces, pubs, housing and employment. A common sign seen in front of businesses was "No Irish, no blacks and no dogs." The sign even existed before the Windrush generation arrived in 1948. There were few black people living in Britain pre-1948, and most of them were descendants of the short-lived slave trade in the UK or served for the British military during World War I and World War II. But the problem became greater post-1948, which led to the civil rights movement all over the country. One prominent campaign during this time was the Bristol Bus Boycott. Inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott, racialised folk living in the city of Bristol, West England, organised a mass boycott of buses from April 30th, 1963 to August 28th, 1963. The state-owned Bristol Omnibus Company refused to employ African, Caribbean or Asian bus crews. The only job that they could have was working in the canteen to serve food for white bus crews. The boycott was led by youth worker Paul Stevenson and the West Indian Development Council. The campaign was successful. After 4 months, when the company overturned the colour bar. The boycott also drew national attention to racial discrimination in the UK, as the campaign was also supported by some MPs. The colour bar in buses was enforced in the first place in 1955, after the passenger group of the Transport and General Workers Union, TGWU, a union that represents bus workers but not limited to them, voted overwhelmingly to pass a resolution banning coloureds from being employed as bus crews. The TGWU had actually said if a black man stopped on the bus as a conductor, every wheel will stop. In 1964, the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, or CARD, was formed. Founded by Trinidadians CLR James and Marion Glean, Cambridge and Harvard trained lawyer Anthony Lester, Grenadian Dr. David Pitt, and Indian academic Deepak Nandi, CARD was Britain's answer to the NAACP. The foundation of the organisation was inspired by Martin Luther King's visit to the UK, where he gave a speech at St Paul's Cathedral in London. King advocated for the coloured population in Great Britain to organise, which led to a lot of immigrant activists and their organisations to create an organisation of organisations, which led to the formation of CARD. CARD lobbied for race relations legislation and adopted the lobbying techniques from the NAACP. The NAACP's lobbying efforts included drafting bills and amendments for legislatures and face-to-face meetings with members of the US Senate and Congress. A Labour government was elected in 1965. Although the party still supported immigration controls such as the racist Commonwealth Act 1962, which heavily restricted immigration from Britain's colonies and former colonies, Labour's Home Secretary Frank Soskis introduced the Race Relations Bill to Parliament on April 7, 1965. The first reading of the bill proposed that racial discrimination in places of public resort should be banned, and those found guilty of racial hatred would be fined up to £1,000 and face the possibility of 2 years imprisonment. This was progress, but the bill still lacked effectiveness. CARD took the opportunity to act as the leading voice within the inner circles of a newly elected Labour government, lobbying on behalf of Black Britons and migrant communities of colour. CARD's legal subcommittee was chaired by Anthony Lester. They drew up what was called a Green document, which proposed amendments to the bill. First off, they believed that criminal prosecution was the wrong way to go about it. They said that the main object of the law in this field should be to alter conduct, not to punish. Their alternative solution would be to allow victims of racial discrimination to take their matters to court. Secondly, Lester suggested the expansion of the scope of the legislation into the fields of housing, employment, credit facilities and insurance. CARD sent its letters to every MP, the Cabinet and to the Attorney General to gain government support for their proposals. David Pitt, who was the chairman of CARD, would use face-to-face lobbying, befriending MPs to garner support. Additionally, CARD would have meetings with both the Home Secretary and the Shadow Home Secretary to discuss the proposals. Legal scholar Michael Zander supported CARD, and through him, CARD had The Guardian, The Times and The Sunday Times publish sympathetic op-eds of the proposed amendments. The lobbying campaign was a huge success, and amendments were drafted for the second reading of the bill. It also involved the establishment of a race relations board and regional conciliatory committees. The Race Relations Act was finally passed on November 8, 1965, but not all amendments were included. Discrimination based on housing and employment were left out, even though these were two major areas that Black Britons faced discrimination in. CARD began another campaign in 1966. This was called the Summer Project. This was to test the effectiveness of the race relations bill, and also point out that anti-black discrimination was still very much common, especially in those two areas. CARD distributed 10,000 leaflets to Black Britons. These leaflets were titled "How to Expose Discrimination." CARD sent 24 school leavers and university students into 3 areas around the UK: Hyde Park in Leeds, Moss Side in Manchester, and Southall in West London for 3 weeks. White students and non-white students were paired up in role-playing tasks. A white student applied for a housing or employment opportunity. A Black or Asian student who was more qualified would also apply for the same position or housing. The test cases showed that Black and Asian Britons were denied jobs based on their racial background. In 1967, CARD sent over 150 complaints gathered during the summer project to the Race Relations Board. 90% of the complaints were based on problems outside the scope of the Race Relations Act 1965. Most of these complaints regarded housing, employment, and the issuing of credit. The Times and the Sunday Times, the Guardian and the Observer, which is the Guardian's Sunday newspaper, the Economist and the Sunday Telegraph noted on the test cases and supported anti-discrimination legislation being expanded to housing and employment. The testing campaign was a success, and the new Race Relations Act in 1968 was introduced, which outlawed discrimination in housing, employment, and public services. Unfortunately, CARD collapsed in the same year because the organisation failed to achieve one of their aims, which was to mobilise the coloured community on its own behalf and unify the immigrants. Because CARD modelled its membership after the NAACP, this meant the inclusion of white liberals in leadership positions that alienated many immigrants who became inspired by Black Power after Kwame Ture's visit in London and the West Indian Gazette's advocating for Black self-determination. CARD also catered to the middle class, but the new Black Power movement had catered to the working class. In 1968, Mahesh Upadhyaya became the first person in the UK to bring a racial discrimination case to court using the recently introduced Race Relations Act 1968. A Yemeni immigrant who came from Aden, a housing developer, George Hay and Sons, refused to sell him a house for him and his family. He rang up the developer. The person on the phone said, "Are you the coloured family who had a look around earlier?" Upadhyaya replied, "Yes." The person then said, "Our policy is not to sell to coloured people because that will jeopardise the sales of our other properties." The Race Relations Act 1968 said it was illegal to refuse housing, employment or public service to a person on the grounds of colour, race, ethnicity or national origin. Unfortunately, he lost the case because the Act was still at its infancy, which meant the protocols and the procedures required were not fully developed. However, the court panel did agree that the developer was in the wrong. So this is it, guys. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope you learned a lot from it. Sources are in the description for you to read further about the individual cases mentioned in this video. Leave a thumbs up, subscribe, and keep notified if you have enjoyed it. And if you would like to donate so I can further develop my YouTube channel, then please look at the link at the description. See you next time.